Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to Anjou, and we're looking at the Patrick Baudouin 2017 Anjou Rouge La Fresnaye. Having spent his childhood and much of his adult life in Paris, a life as a vigneron was not the initial nor obvious choice for Patrick Baudouin. But it was the wines of the Foucault brothers of Clos Rougeard and the wines of Marc Angeli that inspired Patrick to return to his native Anjou in 1990 to establish his domaine, beginning with the parcels that his great-grandparents acquired back in the 1920s. Following the philosophies of traditional viticulture and winemaking, eschewing modern techniques as the Foucaults did, Patrick quickly cemented himself alongside the likes of Jo Pithon, Vincent Ogereau, and others, who became this new band of vignerons that were leading a renaissance in the Coteau du Layon region that would soon spread across the entire Anjou appellation. Today, Patrick Baudouin's domaine spans around 13.5 hectares of vines. The majority of this is planted with Chenin Blanc, but they are working with around 3 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines. And Cabernet Franc takes the lead in 2 of the domaine's red wines. These are the Coteau du Layon and La Fresnaye, which is of course the wine that we're looking at today. And Cabernet Franc is the supporting role in their other red cuvée, Les Touches. Their vineyard parcels are dotted across 3 communes in the Coteau du Layon region in western Anjou. These are Saint-Aubin-de-Luigné, Rochefort-sur-Loire, and Chaux-sur-Layon. They also have a small parcel of Chenin Blanc planted in the Vineyard region. The domaine and its vineyards have been certified organic as well since 2002. Now, it has been some time since I have done a deep dive on a red wine from Anjou, and there's good reason for this. While Cabernet Franc is the most planted variety in the Anjou Saumur region, accounting for around 41% of the area under vine, in this part of Anjou, this is really where Cabernet Franc is used predominantly for rosé production, and this is where Chenin Blanc takes over as the star. And Cabernet Franc needs to be planted on very specific sites in order to be successful for red wines. So why is this? Why is it here that all of a sudden we see this shift away from Cabernet Franc and towards Chenin Blanc? Well, ultimately it comes down to the growing environment here as well as the soils. So in this part of Anjou, we are in the rain-shadow effect of the Haut-Bocage Vendée, which is part of this ancient mountain range that was once as high as the Alps. And then over hundreds of millions of years, these rocks became weathered down to really just a couple hundred meters high in most places. But this elevation is enough to block out the precipitation and the influence from the Atlantic Ocean. So this part of Western Anjou is quite dry. It receives around 600 to 700 millimeters precipitation annually, making it one of the driest areas in all of the Loire Valley. Now, in terms of soils, in this part of Western Anjou, right around the village of Tourarcé, is where the old rocks of the Massif Mauricain take over from the limestone soils of the Paris Basin. And these soils, which are collectively known as Anjou Noir, are comprised predominantly of schists, as well as some slates and sandstones. And all of these are these dark, brittle, dense rocks that have very poor water holding capacity. Now, Cabernet Franc as a grape variety is not drought tolerant. And the combination of the low rainfall here, as well as these very arid, well-draining soils, means that Cabernet Franc can struggle a little bit here. It can suffer from hydric stress. This hydric stress can lead to an imbalance in the vine that can lead to excessive pyrazines. And because Cabernet Franc has structure, because of its inherent rusticity, if you will, this can actually be amplified on schist, and that can create wines that have more rustic tannins, more strict tannins, we sometimes say, in terms of that mouthfeel. So all of that is to say, in Western Anjou, on these schist soils and in this particular area, site selection for Cabernet Franc becomes quite critical. And ideally, we're looking for sites that have much deeper soils, as well as hopefully a little bit more clay in the topsoil as well, which will help with moisture retention capacity. Now, looking at the parcels for today's wine, this is coming from parcels that are located in the commune of Saint-Aubin-de-Luigné. And this is one of the communes of the Coteau du Layon, and there's actually 27 communes that make up this region. But there are 6 that have been identified as crus. These are the 6 communes that are really closest to the city of Angers, and they have been identified as the top qualitative communes for Coteau du Layon, and Saint-Aubin-de-Luigné is one of those 6 communes. Now, this commune is unique in that it has vineyards on both sides of the Layon River. And what that means from a geological perspective is we are dealing with some pretty complex soils here. So on the north side of the right bank of the Layon, this is where we find the Saint-Georges series of schists, and there are quite a few different kinds of schists here. And we also find the Carboniferous sandstone. And then on the south side of the Layon, or the left bank of the Layon River, this is where we find the Briovarian schist, and it's dominated by the Briovarian schist, with the exception of a very small, narrow vein of schist that actually is part of that St. Georges series of schists, which is in the center of the southern part of the commune. Now, this wine is coming from around 0.9 hectares of vines, and it's from a single lieu-dit. La Fresnaye is the lieu-dit, and we are about 1.5 kilometers south of the Layon River here, and we're at an average elevation of around 58 meters above sea level, and the parcels are oriented ever so slightly to the north. Now, in terms of soils, we're dealing with essentially 2 blocks here. In the southern part of this lieu-dit, where the parcels are, we have shallower soils, and we have a greater impact of that schist. So the topsoil is a clay sandy silt mix, so it's limon, sableau, argileux in French, and there's not a lot of topsoil. There's about 50 to 70 centimeters of topsoil, followed by that schist, and here it's a schist gris, a gray schist. And then in the upper portion of the vineyard, we have colluvium. And what's interesting about colluvium is it's eroded material. So it's soils that are derived from eroded material. So we have schist here, but we also perhaps have a little bit of Devonian limestone, because there's this little vein of Devonian limestone that also runs through this particular area. So we have a mix of materials in the colluvium, and this section in the upper portion of the vineyard is also quite deep, so that's good for Cabernet Franc. So we have a clay sandy silt texture in terms of the topsoil, and then that's followed by a subsoil that also has that clay sandy silt texture. Now, in terms of the vines themselves and their age, one section was planted in 1997, and then the oldest block was planted in 1950. Now, in terms of the winemaking, Patrick takes a low interventionist approach in the cellar. So we're dealing with hand-harvested fruit here. The fruit is all destemmed, and fermentation is done in stainless steel tanks with indigenous yeast. And then the maceration technique here is infusion. So essentially, there's very little by way of extractive techniques. It's really just a steeping of the skins with the wine. The total time on skins is around 30 days, and then aging takes place in older Burgundian barrels, and it's for about 9 months before the wine is bottled, and a minimal sulfur is used throughout the winemaking process as well as before bottling. So let's dive into this wine. If you've been following me for a long time, before I get into the wine, if you've been following me for some time, you will notice that I do some pretty nerdy dissections of the soils of the Loire Valley, and I did not dive into that too much here with regards to these Anjou Noir soils, because quite frankly, the examples of Cabernet Franc from this area are not as available as what I'd like to be able to understand better how these different schists and slates and sandstones and how they impact the finished wine. So I took a rather broad viewpoint of those particular soils in regards to Cabernet Franc, but my hope is that as I taste more and perhaps spend a bit more time in that part of the region, I'll get a better sense of perhaps what these, what the Carboniferous sandstone does for Cabernet Franc and what the gray schist does versus these Bavarian schist and all those kinds of things. But for now, what I want to hopefully communicate here is kind of the energy that I feel from Cabernet Franc on schist soils. So immediately what leads here is spice, actually. There's a bit of fruit, of course, but there's a lot of spice to the nose. It's quite savory in nature. And the fruit profile that I am getting here, it's like small, little, wild, teeny tiny little berries. So like wild foresty berries, like maybe like a lingonberry, or there's like a black raspberry. There's maybe even black currant here. It's a mix of red and darker fruits. There's a bit of that brambly thing going on. And then, as I said, it's this just wash, wealth, like spice. So it's a mix of things. We're getting clove, there's allspice, there's almost a little bit of fenugreek or ginger, like dry ginger here. There's even like a little bit of a paprika or a chili flake thing happening too. But it's really lovely. Like the nose is quite lifted, super open, very fragrant. There's a little bit of a herbal component to it as well that's coming through for me as kind of like cedar. There's a little bit of like thyme. There's a bit of oregano here. There's some beautiful like dried flowers. And I know this is a younger wine, but the flowers are coming across to me as a bit more dried in terms of dried floral notes as well. But overall, the nose is super, super intriguing. Really, it kind of just makes you want to dive in. It's very seductive in a way. On the palate, there's a bit more fruit here on the palate, which is nice. A bit more crunchy fruits, but again, those small kind of foresty wild berries. The fruit has a bit of a sauvage edge to it, which I kind of like. In terms of the profile of this wine, what leads here and what I find consistent across other examples of Cabernet Franc from these Anjou Noir soils is what leads is tannin first. I find when I have a Cabernet Franc on limestone, what leads is acid, and then the tannins kind of work with the acid in a really interesting way. Whereas it's like the tannins come forward first, and then the acid supports, if you will. And that's really what this is doing. So in the mouth, what leads here is this firm, almost unyielding profile to the tannins. There is this kind of rigidity to the tannins. There isn't the same ease of the tannins here, and that's not a slight. That's just the nature of the wine. And what's great about this is there is a beautiful plushness to the fruit profile and fullness and roundness to the mouthfeel that kind of almost envelops those tannins in a really nice way. Coats them, I guess, is a really good way of describing it, and makes them not feel quite as rigid. The acidity is beautiful, really energetic, really crunchy, really fresh. And yeah, I just love how all of the components are working together here. There's a bit of like a crushed rock thing here on the back end. There's a touch of leather as well. You get all of that spice as well on the palate, which is really awesome. But really, I tasted this wine probably a couple months ago for the first time. I was just like, I was immediately taken with it. There was just something really intriguing, very thought-provoking about it. It made me think, and I love that. I love wines that I can just drink and not really think about in terms of Cabernet Franc, but I also really love when Cabernet Franc challenges me. And this wine did that when I tasted it the first time. And it's a really, really cool example of Cabernet Franc from the Loire. Yeah. It's super intriguing. It's very engaging. Like it kind of sucks you in this way where you're like, it's constantly changing and evolving and it's doing different things. And you go back into the glass and you're like, there's something else there that wasn't there the first time. And I love that. And I don't taste enough Anjou Cabernet Franc, and I need to do more of this because I find the wines really cool and really just different, and I love kind of diving into them every once in a while. And this is a really fantastic example of Anjou Rouge from the Anjou Noir soils, and I hope I have a chance to kind of dive into a couple of Patrick's other cuvées, as well as kind of explore this part of the Loire Valley a little bit more in the future. But these are fun wines to pull out of your cellar and look for, and even to do like fun side-by-sides with something from, say, saumur-champigny or saumur-bourgueil or something like this, just as a point of comparison, because it's a fun little adventure as far as tasting exploration is concerned. And if you've done this before, maybe if you're a nerd like me, let me know what your experience was with a Anjou Rouge from the schist soils versus, say, something from limestone. I would love to know your thoughts on that kind of comparison in the comments below. But of course, as always, this was a great wine and a great discovery today, and I will be back again soon with another wine as always. Cheers.